Hello, and thank you for joining the Research Forum's Symposium on Islamic Metalwork. I'm Alexandra Gerstein, McQueen Curator of Sculpture and Decorative Arts at the Courtauld, and I have great pleasure in welcoming you to this symposium, which we hope will shed a light on some of the behind-the-scenes research, planning, and delivery of the touring exhibition, Precious and Rare Islamic Metalwork from the Courtauld. The exhibition is a partnership between the Courtauld and the Subject Specialist Network in Islamic Art and Material Culture, the SSN. Back in 2017, the SSN's chair, Dr. Rebecca Bridgman, and I met and we came up with a plan, and we approached the Art Fund with our idea, which was that 10 of the Courtauld's most remarkable pieces of Islamic metalwork would travel to 3 museums in the UK during the Courtauld's temporary closure for a major refurbishment project. I would like to extend a warm thanks on behalf of the Courtauld to Art Fund for having endorsed the project immediately and enthusiastically. We sent a call for participation to the SSN's wide network of museums throughout the country who have any Islamic art in their collections. When we realized that we had 4 really unturndownable applications from museums rather than 3, we asked Art Fund to expand their support, which they did without hesitation. We could not have hoped for a more varied and collaborative group of museums and people to work with, all of which became ever more evident when 2020 happened to all of our plans. At the Courtauld, I wish to thank my colleagues Amy Graves, Professor Susan Babai, Janet O'Brien, and Matthew Thompson, all of who really made a significant contribution to the exhibition tour. As always, we are grateful to the stellar team at the Research Forum for an Inch, and Acacia Finbow in particular, and to Torch, the Oxford Research Centre in the Humanities, for its help in publicising the event through its channels. There is no doubt that this tour has generated new research into the objects, including new translations of all the inscriptions by the scholar Dr. Will Kwiatkowski, and new approaches to their interpretation. It's also been a catalyst for the transformative conservation campaign by my esteemed colleague and Courtauld adoptee, because she's worked with us often, Diana Heath. When the collection returns to the Courtauld in 2021, late 2021, I relish to think of the ways in which our understanding of this collection has been enhanced by this tour. If objects have secret lives, as I used to think as a child, then these vessels, bowls, boxes, incense balls, candlesticks, and dishes will enclose all the crude experiences that have taken place during this partnership tour. Although, of course, it's been at times nail-biting with the uncertainties of lockdown and, as you will hear, with the completely new ways of doing things that the pandemic has engendered. But much more than that, it's been a really joyous experience to see our objects in so many different contexts. In this time of anxiety, of fragmented, polarized communities, it's been really heartening to see how objects made for the luxury market some 500 years ago have transited through the lives of so many diverse collections and people and places. And opposite to that, because at their essence, these objects, most of them, are themselves transnational and transcultural. This symposium was conceived with Dr. Francesca Leoni, Assistant Keeper and Curator of Islamic Art at the Ashmolean Museum, and in partnership with Dr. Federica Gigante of the History of Science Museum. We wanted to do something a little different, a cross between 2 genres, the specialist and the practical, or the scholarly and the applied. We thought this fitting as the Courtauld, the Ashmolean, and the History of Science Museum in Oxford are all university museums. Francesca is Assistant Keeper, Research Associate at the Khalili Research Centre for the Study of Islamic Art and Material Culture, and a member of the Oriental Faculty at the University of Oxford. Amongst her most recent publications are the volume she co-edited, Islamic Occult Sciences in Theory and Practice, and the catalogue Aegean Legacies, Greek Island Embroideries from the Ashmolean Museum, which accompanies her latest exhibition, which will be on view as soon as the Ashmolean reopens. I'm grateful to Francesca for keeping to this vision that we had, and to our distinguished keynote speaker, Professor James Allan, for starting us off in great style. And now I pass on to Francesca.
Thank you, Alexandra, and a warm welcome to our guest speakers and to our public, national and international, from me as well. I'm here today in a double capacity as both the moderator of today's event and on behalf of the Subject Specialist Network for Islamic Art and Material Culture, or as we call it, SSN. The SSN for Islamic Art and Material Culture is really delighted to partner with the Courtauld and Torch at the University of Oxford for this symposium, which celebrates a hugely successful and highly anticipated touring exhibition, but which equally offers an important opportunity really to learn from its achievements and challenges. The SSN chair, Rebecca Bridgman, is very sorry not to be able to speak in person today, as she is currently on furlough leave, but she is, I believe, in the audience, and she asked me to pass her best wishes and thanks to everyone involved. Today's event really captures the essence and mission of the Subject Specialist Network, that of combining academic expertise and public outreach, as Sasha has already mentioned. As an organization, the network strives to support museums across the UK in researching and developing their collections of Islamic art and material culture, and to help them to use that knowledge to reach out and engage audiences that reflect contemporary society. Over the last 5 years, through funding from Art Council England, our SSN has supported 18 organizations through targeted specialist support schemes that have really unlocked their collections' potential. These opportunities have produced a considerable number of outcomes and really long-lasting benefits, from temporary and permanent displays of Islamic art in these very institutions to events designed for knowledge sharing and community engagement that have revitalized local resources and interest in the Islamic cultural legacy. The partnership of the Subject Specialist Network with the Courtauld to tour their exceptional collection of Islamic metalwork through the support of the Art Fund was an important and further fruitful development in that activity, one that I believe showed the increased capacity and ambition that resulted from the network's work with these regional museums. Some of the institutions who apply to host Precious and Rare, in fact, have received specialist support in recent years. And it is rewarding to see how the interest for this material has continued to flourish after that specific experience. Therefore, we'd like to offer a huge thanks and a big congratulations to the 4 institutions and their dedicated staff who really responded to the offer of the tour and fulfilled the vision of the SSN to give back to our public and audiences. Although the tour and the collaboration between the SSN and the Courtauld is entering its final stage, the Subject Specialist Network as an organization will continue to work, and we are going to soon announce a study day on Islamic calligraphy planned for the end of January 2021 and led by the British Library. And if you would like to find more about this and more generally about our Subject Specialist Network, do visit our webpage at www.islamicartssn.org or do follow us on Twitter at IslamSSN. It is now time for me to introduce our keynote speaker, Professor James Allan, Emeritus Professor of Eastern Art at the University of Oxford and former keeper of the Eastern Art Department at the Ashmolean Museum. I'm especially pleased to be able to introduce him as I try to fill his very large shoes every day in my job at the Ashmolean. Professor Allan's outstanding career has always been tied to the University of Oxford and his Art and Archaeology Museum, the Ashmolean, establishing and nourishing the most important collection of Islamic art in the UK outside of London, and inspiring the teaching of Islamic art in more ways than one. Years before the Khalili Research Center was established, Professor Allan used our collections to train generations of art historians, and many of these have now gone up to become leading experts in the field. Professor Allan's interests and publications span media, geography, and centuries, from Islamic ceramics and Yemeni architecture to the art of Twelver Shi'ism and modern Arab art and interfaith work. Yet, it is Islamic metalwork that ran as a continuous thread throughout his long and successful career, beginning with a DPhil in 1976, focusing on metalworking industry of Iran in the early Islamic period, which was published later on in 1975 under the title of Persian Metal Technology 1700-1300, which is still to this day the principal reference work on this subject, to work on exceptional metalwork collections, the Nuhada Said collection, for instance, which was published in 1982, comprising unique Mamluk inlaid specimens, the Iron collection, which was published in 1986, and the Tanavuli collection of steel, published in 2003. There is no better person, therefore, to speak about the topic of metalwork and Islamic metalwork, and give us a sense of the value and the significance of the objects that are touring around the country. And for those who have not seen Precious and Rare, there is still a chance to do so, either at the History of Science Museum here in Oxford through early January, or in Bath at the Holborn Museum, which will be the fourth and final venue early next year. Just a final reminder before I hand over to Professor Allan, there will be a bit of time for questions at the end of his lecture before we move on to the panel. So feel free to type your questions into the chat box function, which is at the bottom of your screen, and I shall read them in the order in which they are received. Professor Allan, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you for that introduction. May I first of all compliment those who compiled the virtual gallery at the History of Science Museum website. Not only is it most informative, but it's already full of great ideas. So in a sense, my presence and my talk may seem superfluous. However, I think it is possible to expand the horizons even further than has already been done, for I'm amazed at the richness of this tiny collection in the Courtauld and how many ideas it offers for educationalists, teachers, guides, and others. That's the brief of my talk today. Just so you know where I'm going, I'd like to look in succession at collectors like Gambier Parry, at inlaid brasses, at trade, at the differing uses of objects in different cultures, at the world of family businesses, and a little about Islamic art and design and its impact on Renaissance taste. So, first of all, to collectors. And where better to begin than with Thomas Gambier Parry, who put this collection of metalwork together. The Courtauld Institute website gives fascinating information about Gambier Parry, and he was a Victorian philanthropist, amateur artist, and author. And I quote from the website, best remembered as a discerning collector who built a formidable collection of medieval and Renaissance fine and decorative art. Gambier Parry's aesthetic sensibilities were deeply influenced by his strong religious feeling. He was a devoted Anglo-Catholic and a committed churchgoer who actively engaged in church-related debates of his day. His collection of sacred art bears witness to a man whose love of the beautiful was deeply entwined with his longing for the sacred. End of quote. Religion will appear again in what I have to say in a minute. Now, Gambier Parry's family earned their wealth as directors of the East India Trading Company. That, of course, touches on the problems of empire, on the contemporary debates over statues of Cecil Rhodes or Edward Colston, and on the methods used by members of the East India Company to acquire wealth. And if you haven't done so, you might enjoy reading William Dalrymple's book, The Anarchy, which has a lot to say on that subject. And incidentally, you may have heard on the news this morning that the Welsh devolved government has been tracking street names and statues of people associated with the slave trade in Wales. But whatever you think of empire, Gambier Parry made honourable use of his wealth, devoting himself to philanthropy by founding and funding an orphanage, a school, and a children's hospital. So we have here a collector who drew his wealth from the trade of empire, but was a great philanthropist. We also have a very religious man to whom art spoken as spiritual dimension. Plenty to think about. And if one's interested in collecting, then comparisons abound among collectors of Islamic art. Think of the British Museum, Sir Augustus Wollaston Franks, responsible for the acquisition of many of the great Islamic objects in the museum's collection. His father was a banker and mother the daughter of an heiress, so he had an abundance of inherited wealth. But he ploughed most of it directly or indirectly into building the British Museum's collection. Or Frederick Duquesne Godman, who collected his Arabesques and Islamic wares, which came to the British Museum on the death of his also came from a wealthy family. But in this case, his father, Joseph Godman, was a partner in the brewery firm Whitbread Company. So the family money, at least in part, came from beer. Or think of Sir Robert Murdoch Smith, born in Kilmarnock in 1835, who acquired Iranian ceramics for the then South Kensington Museum, now the V&A, while serving as a royal engineer in Iran in the 1870s and 80s. He was in fact working on the laying of the telegraph cable. And recall lesser-known collectors like Ellen Tanner, one of the first women to travel solo to the Middle East, in particular to Iraq and Iran, at the very end of the 19th century. And her collection of exotica is in the Holborn Museum in Bath. And these were late collectors in the game. Lorenzo de' Medici, Lorenzo the Magnificent, who died in 1469, had a collection of Islamic metalwork consisting of 41 candlesticks, 20 bowls, 16 jugs, 13 basins, 6 incense burners, 5 inkwells, 5 mugs, 4 buckets, and 3 lamps. So there's a world of collectors which the Courtauld Islamic metalwork opens up for us. But now let's move on to Gambier Parry's collection. The first thing to notice is that it's inlaid metalwork, that is, some form of copper alloy, usually brass, inlaid with silver. Why is that of interest? There has always been a hierarchy in metals. The most valuable has always been gold, because it doesn't tarnish and can't be dissolved. Next, silver, and then base metals like copper and its alloys, bronze and brass. Gold and silver, if they are made into objects, were constantly being melted down and turned into coin, because rulers needed to pay their troops. It was only in religious settings in Europe, in cathedral or church treasuries, that silver survived in medieval times, and very few such religious treasuries existed in the Islamic world. Those that did were in the Shiite shrines in Iraq and Iran, most of which have been plundered over the centuries. So we have very little surviving Islamic silver. But inlaid brass, although inlaid with silver, did not contain enough silver to be worth melting down, so it survived. And the rare surviving pieces of Islamic silver suggest that the workmanship on Islamic inlaid brasses, like this one I'm showing you, is of a quality equivalent to that on silver pieces. Hence, we're privileged to be looking at top quality metalwork, as in this beautiful little inlaid box.
Oh, James, really sorry to interrupt you. You're actually scratching some paper over the microphone right now, so we're getting a bit of a scratchy noise. So if you could just make sure that the paper isn't touching the computer, that'll help with the audio quality.
Thank you. Sorry about that.
That's all right.
Now let's move on. We don't know the origin of every piece in the Gambier Parry collection, but I'm grateful. I'm grateful to Dr. Sasha Gerstein, who has looked into this question. As a result of her research, we know that at least 10 of them were acquired in Venice or on the Croatian coast. Italy, as we've seen, was the home of Renaissance collectors like Lorenzo de' Medici. So this comes as no surprise, and in fact, it brings us conveniently to the topic of trade. There was a flourishing trade across the Mediterranean Sea in the 14th, 15th, and 16th century. Renaissance Italy had the taste and the cash, and the Islamic Near East had the craftsmen. And so we find a huge east-west trade in manufactured goods. For example, rugs and carpets were mainly exported to Italy from Anatolia, modern Turkey, in particular from Istanbul and Bursa. And here's an altarpiece with the Virgin and Child enthroned at the top of an Anatolian carpet. On the other hand, inlaid brasswork was mostly manufactured in Syria and Egypt, and exported through Beirut or Alexandria. However, there was also a trade in other perishable goods like food, medicines, and spices. The most important commodities from the European perspective were spices, especially cinnamon, cloves, pepper, and ginger. These were brought by ship from the Spice Islands in the Far East and were taxed in transit through Egypt, providing an important source of wealth for the Mamluk rulers of the Near East. However, the sacks they were packed in, like their contents, were perishable, so the archaeological evidence of their trade has long since disappeared, which brings us to the first two objects, two lidded bowls and, in fact, a box, three of them. The function of these bowls and the box are not specified on the pieces, or indeed on any such surviving pieces, nor is it clear from any text. But the surmise must be that these objects were meant to contain something precious. And the most likely item is a tree resin called balsam, which was of special importance to the Christian West. Discussing the use of the product in Egypt, Thomas Greenhill, a British surgeon and embalmer, who died in 1740, wrote as follows, quote, "There is no medicine more generally used by the Egyptians than the true balsam, which they esteem as a kind of panacea for all diseases, both external and internal, curing therewith divers sorts of wounds, as also the bitings of venomous creatures. They use it, moreover, as a preservative against the plague and to drive away agues or fevers that proceed from putrefaction." End of quote. Although other uses are identified, balsam is most consistently reported in the treatment of wounds, in ophthalmology, as an antidote, as a calorifacient, that's a heat or warmth producing drug, an effluvient, helping fluid exit from the body, a deobstruent, something that clears or opens natural ducts of fluids and secretions, and as an analgesic to relieve pain. But it also had a ceremonial and religious importance, for balsam was a key ingredient of the oil or chrism used to consecrate rulers at their coronations, to ensure their spiritual as well as secular authority. Hence, it became an essential component of Western Christian royal ceremonies. But why Egypt? The balsam plantation at Matariya, located approximately 5 miles north of Cairo, was in fact famous in the Near East and in Europe throughout the medieval period. The crops of balsam gathered annually from its balsam trees were considered to be of particularly high quality, but more important were the legends concerning the visit of the Holy Family. The Coptic tradition records that the Holy Family stopped here during their sojourn in Egypt, and that the infant Christ took Joseph's staff and broke it into pieces and placed them in the ground. The infant then put his hand on the ground to create a spring of water. The water caused the sections of the staff to come into leaf and to give off a fine perfume. This was believed to be the origin of the Matariya balsam garden. In addition, it was believed that only water from that spring could sustain the balsam trees. So the Matariya garden became known as the only source of true balsam and as the one highly valued by the Christian West. No wonder one of these lidded bowls, now in the Bargello in Florence, was originally in the Medici collection. But one of the Courtauld lidded bowls has much more to tell us, in particular about its maker. For this lidded bowl, incidentally bought by Gambia Parry on the Croatian coast, is in the name of a man called Mahmoud al-Kurdi, who entitles himself Muallim. Who was he? Where did he work? What does his title, Muallim, mean? Unsurprisingly, we don't have his biography, but he almost certainly worked in Cairo, and Muallim in Arabic means master craftsman. It's the word too for a teacher. But not only was Mahmoud a master craftsman, but he was also the son of a master craftsman, another master metalworker. For on a salver in the British Museum, he signs his name as Mahmoud, son of al-Kurdi, son of al-Muallim. In other words, he was the son of a master craftsman. Here is a master craftsman at work in the Isfahan Copper Bazaar. And the father-son craft industry is also exemplified by another contemporary Cairene metalworker, Zainuddin. He was the maker of a bucket in the Victorian Albert and is known from a bowl in the Khalili collection to have also been the son of a muallim, master craftsman, by the name of Umar. The Courtauld's bucket is so similar in form and design to the V&A piece, which I shall say more about later, that is almost certainly by this man, Zainuddin. So these pieces take us into the world of family businesses, which still survive today among the craftsmen of the Islamic world. And here are a couple of contemporary steelworking craftsmen in Isfahan involved in the manufacture of steel standards for Shiite processions. On the left is a man who comes from at least 3 generations of steelworking craftsmen, and the other 2 are brothers in their own family business. Yet another feature of Mahmud's covered bowl is interesting, however, for Mahmud's signature has been translated into Latin on the opposite rim to the Arabic. Clearly, this was a piece to be exported to Europe, and Mahmud wanted more commissions to come his way. And the empty European shape of shield on another bowl makes the European destiny of so many of these pieces perfectly clear. Another object which tells us of the Middle Eastern European trade is the spherical incense burner. Before discussing its significance in trade, however, we need to be aware of its original internal mechanism, for it would originally have been fitted with a small iron bowl set in gimbals. A gimbal consists of a ring or base on an axis that permits an object mounted in or on it to tilt freely in any direction, in effect suspending the object so that it will remain horizontal even when its support is tipped. The gimbals kept the burning incense from spilling when the ball was rolled from guest to guest in a culture where sitting on the floor, low cushions was the norm. Gimbals were first described by the Greek inventor Philo of Byzantium in 280 BC, but they're still of huge importance today, for example, in naval compasses, but more recently in drones. But now, returning to the connections between the Middle East and Europe, these spherical incense burners were used in medieval Europe, not for incense, but as hand warmers, a function they could fulfill extremely effectively. A fine example of a medieval Irish or English copy made to be a hand warmer and dating from the 12th century is in the Hunt Museum, Limerick. Medieval hand warmers such as this one were predominantly used by priests as they celebrated Mass. During long sermons inside the chilly, unheated churches of the Middle Ages, the priest's hands often became numb due to cold. This led to the very real possibility that the Blessed Sacrament might be dropped during the service. To prevent this from happening, some of the larger and more affluent churches invested in these decorative hand warmers. Gambier Parry's spherical incense burner is decorated with astrological figures, tiny images of the planets, 6 including the moon, around the sun. Islamic astrological images are in general based on the classical tradition, but here, as is usually the case in the Islamic world, Venus is shown as a female figure playing a quintessentially Islamic musical instrument, the oud or lute, illustrating the way Islamic artists molded what they received to their taste. And the oud player, Venus, is visible top left of your left-hand screen. This leads us into pictorial representations in Islamic art, the whole problem of aniconism in Islam. This is a topic worthy of a lecture on its own, but here may I make quite clear that pictures of people and animals do indeed exist in Islamic art. And if you have any doubts, look not only at the spherical incense burner with its astrological images, but also at this beautiful inlaid bag or wallet, which is decorated with so many tiny images like that on the right-hand side of your screen. but many, many more along the narrow top, where we find royal and other figures in a court scene. So not only are there musicians as well on the rest of the wallet, but also huntsmen and falconers. So please refuse to follow the Wahhabi fundamentalist line that there is no imagery in Islamic art. Even if it doesn't dominate Islamic art in the way it has traditionally dominated Christian art, it is plentiful. Among these images, we find plenty to interest our public, though one would obviously need detailed photographs in an exhibition to enable them to appreciate the tiniest ones. But we find musical instruments, we find wine drinking activities, regal symbols here like the parasol, inkwell, and bag, and also some Mongol hats. Hats are actually a topic of some interest. Here's a painting from the 14th century of women and indeed a ruler and his consort all wearing wonderful hats. And their particular interest, Mongol hats, because they were the origin of the European medieval hennin, shown on the right. Incidentally, many of the items shown on this object are discussed in the book on this wonderful piece, Courtauld Craft, edited by Rachel Ward and published by the Courtauld in 2014. So there's nothing, I think, there on the hats. So more could be done on that subject. But talking of Mongol costume reminds me of Chaucer's Canterbury Tales, where there is a fascinating allusion to Mongol clothes. Quote, "On a bay steed whose trappings were of steel, covered in cloth of gold from haunch to heel, fretted with diaper like Mars to see, his surcoat in cloth of Tartary, studded with great white pearls, beneath its fold of saddle of new beaten burnished gold." That's a translation by Neville Coggill. Wonderful use of language, as of course is Chaucer saying. Tartar, i.e. Mongol cloth, was cloth of silk and gold. That is a gold brocade in which the gold thread is a supplementary weft. In the reign of Edward III, 1327 to 1377, at the Cheapside tournament of 1331, 16 participants rode through the streets of London in the opening procession attired in Tartar, i.e. Mongol clothes, and wearing masks painted of the likeness of the Mongols. So surprisingly, there is a connection between the Mongols and our own culture back there in the 14th century. But back to the objects. Candlesticks. There are a number of candlesticks in Gambier Parry's collection, and one here on the left was made in Anatolia, and two on the right in Venice, though the latter have decoration typical of the Islamic world. However, I want to draw your attention to another incomplete example in the Courtauld on the right. It's in the name of the Mamluk Sultan of Egypt and Syria, Sultan Ahmed, and therefore datable to 1342. And I've put it beside an almost contemporary but complete example in the V&A to show you what it would have looked like originally. We know from an early 14th century Egyptian author El-Makrizi how important candles were in the Near East and how they were used. Hence my need to illustrate this particular example. Here is a passage of Makrizi on court life in 1333 AD, just about the same date as Edward III's tournament, which I've just mentioned. Quote, "On the eve of the 7th of Jumada al-Awwal," that's a Muslim month, "the Sultan sat at the palace gate and the emirs approached one by one according to rank, bringing with them candles. When the first had presented the candle he had brought, he kissed the ground and withdrew. The Sultan continued to sit there until their offerings were complete. The number of candles was 3,030 and their weight 3,060 kintar. Among them were ones over which much trouble had been taken, which had been decorated in a very novel way and with a great variety of embellishment. The finest and the best of them were the candles of the Emir Alameddin Sanjar al-Gawali. He took a great deal of trouble over them and had them made in Damascus. They were very remarkable objects." End of quote. And a bit further on, McQueens writes again, quote, "Then the Sultan sat on the eve of Friday, the 11th of Shaban, another Islamic month, the eve of the marriage feast at the palace gate, and those candles were all lit. And his son, the Emir Arnuk, sat before him. All the emirs approached. Each emir himself carried a candle, with behind him his Mamluks carrying candles. They approached in order of rank and kissed the ground one by one throughout the night." End of quote. In the first quote, the kintar is a very large unit of weight, something equivalent to 100 pounds. So the amount of wax and the size of candles was obviously very impressive, but the precise size is unclear. Each had to be light enough in weight to be carried in procession by a single man. It's also evident that you cannot carry a lighted candle without some sort of holder, and that if you're to present the candle, it needs to be in a candlestick which will safely stand on the ground. So the Courtauld candlesticks are the tip of an iceberg, as it were, 3 examples of many thousands which would have been made. It's no surprise that there are many excellent examples in other galleries and museums around the world, and it's not difficult to imagine an exhibition on candles and candlesticks. Last among the Courtauld collection pieces which I want to focus on, we come to this bucket attributed to, though not signed by, the master craftsman Zainuddin. Precisely what it was used for is uncertain. In an Islamic context, elaborate buckets were probably purchased by wealthy men who wanted to display their wealth in their weekly visit to the local hammam, bathhouse. They were no doubt used for water in Renaissance Europe, but exactly what their function was there, I'm unclear. However, the fascination of this bucket for me lies not so much in its use as in its arabesque decoration, reminding me how important the arabesque is in Islamic art and how it traveled into Europe through the trade in textiles, carpets, and metalwork. And the pair of candlesticks we've just been looking at illustrate the point perfectly. For although they're of Venetian manufacture, they're decorated with arabesque work of Islamic inspiration. And this early 16th century Venetian dish in Gambier Parry's collection shows arabesques which are now moving away further from their Islamic prototype and becoming Europeanized or italicized as they go. We can note different styles of Islamic arabesque on other Courtauld objects, half another spherical incense burner and the lid of a balsam bowl. And on a dish, and on our by now familiar balsam box. That moves us towards another non-representational form of Islamic art, geometric designs. They were common throughout the history of Islamic art, derived as they were from classical antiquity. And of course, on these arabesque decorated objects, you can see the impact of geometry because they're all laid out in a geometric framework. But the Mongol bag here is special, as it is one of a group of inlaid pieces of the 12th to 13th century in which the background is inlaid with a design inspired by Chinese silk. And I couldn't resist putting on this piece on the right a figure of a Venetian dressed in a garment of Chinese silk, possibly made in the 14th century in Mosul in northern Iraq, now in the National Museum of Allan in Dublin. It so neatly summarizes the trading networks of the period. In summary, the richness of the small Courtauld collection of Islamic metalwork allows us huge scope for exploration into Islamic and Renaissance culture and into our own world. We can delve into the lives of collectors like Gambier Parry. We can enjoy the quality of surviving inlaid brasses from medieval times and think of all the precious metalwork that has perished. We can focus on the extensive trade between Europe and the Near East in the Renaissance period, noting the importance of religious beliefs, particularly in the trade in balsam. The use of Latin on Islamic objects to encourage future commissions, the changes in function as objects travelled, from spherical incense burner to hand warmer, and the way Islamic designs travelled westwards and impacted Renaissance taste. We've also caught a glimpse into the world of family businesses in the Islamic craft industries, and we've seen how important particular objects were in their own culture, for example, candlesticks, encouraging us to compare the use of objects in our own traditions. And lastly, we've also witnessed the widespread existence of pictorial representations in Islamic art, alongside wonderful arabesque work and geometric designs, raising the interesting issue of what Islamic art really is, as opposed to what fundamentalists want us to think it is. The Courtauld's Gambia Paris Metalwork collection is a great little collection, and as I hope I've shown, has huge potential for exhibition and education. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Allan, for the journey you have taken us through, and really for exposing the many exciting layers and facets of these objects. Really, as someone who started as an undergraduate in Islamic art, working on metalwork on this very medium, you have reminded me of what makes it so compelling and such a wonderful site of encounters and really exchange, as it's well exemplified indeed by the precious and rare exhibitions. There are so many trajectories and directions we can take it, so much resonance for so many of us as an audience looking at these objects. So thank you for taking us around this range of options. I can see in the chat a couple of questions, and I'm very happy to read them to you and to pass them over to you. The first one asks, how are the origins of the objects determined when no inscriptions are on the objects themselves? And what role do trade routes play for understanding the exchanges?
Well, how we decide what objects were used for if they don't have inscriptions is obviously a matter of surmise. The world is full of surmise these days, isn't it? We all are wanting to know what's going to happen next, and we don't know. But anyway, so if they don't say, we have to guess. So inevitably, the balsam idea is a guess. We can't be absolutely certain. But fortunately, in the Islamic world, a number of types of objects do have inscriptions which say what they were used for, particularly in the later period. But I mentioned bath pails for use in the hammam, and there's an example I came across, an inlaid metal bath pail in the British Museum, which actually has an inscription in Arabic saying it was for use in the hammam. So that sort of thing is extremely valuable. And from that, one builds up a picture of what objects were used for. As the question about trade routes, sorry, could you just repeat that?
Yes, absolutely. What role did trade routes play for understanding the exchanges of objects?
Oh, well, yeah, that's interesting. I mean, trade routes played an enormous part because there were different trade routes. If you look at, for example, at Spanish metalwork, of the Islamic period before the reconquest, it's very closely tied in with the metalwork of North Africa, because the main trade in that part of the Mediterranean was north-south, not east-west. But then you find in particular periods in the 11th century that trade is going across the Mediterranean metalwork too. There are famous groups of metalwork, one particular you can see that they're trading in other ways, but it's very helpful to another question up. It looks as though Have you anything else to ask me, Francesca?
Yes, sorry, the connection had stopped for a moment, so I wasn't sure whether it was you or it was me getting blocked. Yes, we have a couple more questions. One that follows up on what you were saying about the bucket, you know, and their use in very specific contexts. And there is a question that asks whether miniatures could be a source or are a sufficient source for studying metalwork, history of metalwork.
I lost that connection then. I didn't hear what you said.
I repeat the question, whether miniatures are a sufficient source for studying metalwork history, the history of metalwork.
Well, miniatures are very important, but they are only helpful in the later period. I mean, there's very little evidence of metalwork in early painting in the Islamic world, but in the Safavid, the Timurid and Safavid periods, yes, there's very helpful and useful evidence there. But it doesn't compare with the actual evidence of surviving pieces, and particularly surviving pieces who, as has already been mentioned, when they have their inscriptions on, often in poetry, which explain what their function was. Mm-hmm. But it enhances our knowledge, but it isn't the primary source.
I'm very interested in one question. I mean, as I was studying, you know, metalwork, particularly inlaid metalwork, of which many of these examples are, there was a discussion about the role that precious metals, vessels made of precious metals and their use might have had in terms of influencing the development of inlaid metalwork. And so I wonder, we know from sources also that metal vessels were in fact used by Muslim rulers. So how did inlaid metalwork develop as a technique?
Well, that's a controversial question, actually, because there's quite a lot of background there. But my own feeling is that what actually happened was that in the early medieval period, well, say the 11th century, there's an increasing shortage of silver, and prices of silver would go up, and it was more difficult to get hold of. And so metal workers actually moved from doing silver work to doing inlaid work, where you had a base metal object and you put in very small amounts of silver. And that was why it happened. And once the taste had established itself, it continues well into the 15th and 16th century. They're much less important by then because silver and gold have much taken their place. But in the period in question, also in the Mamluk world, which we've been looking at, the Mamluks also had a shortage of precious metal. I think there's very little doubt about that. And so inlaid metalwork was popular in there for them. And once it was popular there and exported, then people in Europe liked the taste too, so they adopted it.
I have maybe time for one more question before we move on to the next section, and actually it comes from Alexandra regarding your final image, you know, that lovely figurine, the Mosul figure, and she asks whether you can say more about sort of the pattern on the robe of the figure, which we see also appears, you know, the fretwork on the Mosul bag, and whether in particular, and she would like to know more about the sort of the translation from one medium to the other, or from one type of object to the other.
Well, that it's very interesting, actually, because that is a Chinese style of geometric design, which only appears in the Islamic world in the sort of 13th century. With the growing importance of silk production in Mosul and elsewhere in the Near East. And it's very different from the typical designs of geometric patterns inherited from the late antique world, which Arab craftsmen used up until that time. And you can find its parallel in surviving fragments of Chinese silk from tombs in China. So it's clearly a Chinese style of design. And I suspect from I'm confident that from the, here surviving miniatures are important, from surviving miniatures, that silk was incredibly important and prestigious among the wealthy and the rulers in the Near East. And it was then exported westwards. And of course, Italy under the Renaissance becomes a silk producing area. And so with that must have traveled the designs. They'd already traveled from China to the Near East, where in the Near East you get silk being made in the Chinese style. And that's the sort of thing it means. And then that would have been exported further west. So that's the nature of the design. The actual costume I would like to know more about, and maybe there's someone who can tell me. I said it's Venetian, but I'm not clear whether that type of costume is limited to Venice or is it found throughout Italy. So there's lots more to know about that object, and I'm absolutely intrigued that it's, to my mind, never been published. I came across it when I visited Dublin many years ago, and there was a postcard of it. And then I had a curator ask me about whether I thought it was Islamic. If it's made in Mosul and it looks as though it's typical of Mosul inlaid metalwork, it would be good to analyze it to see if it fits into the type of base metal alloy made in Mosul. Then it is unique because it's a sculpture of a human being dressed in a Chinese costume. So it would be really fascinating to know more.
Yes, indeed. I mean, an object of great conversation, but thank you for actually using it sort of as a final point, as a reminder of this, the networks, the conversations that these objects facilitate. Now it's 4:52, so I think what we're going to do, I'm going to hold on to some of the questions for maybe the discussions at the end, when we will have an opportunity to maybe pick up on some of these strands again. But I would like to thank you, Professor Allan, for your contribution. And I'll now move on to our next session and welcome our 5 panelists to join the floor, all of whom are representatives of the institutions involved with the touring exhibition of Precious and Rare. And as you will hear from their talks, they will address this experience from a range of viewpoints, touching on both the successes and the challenges that have been experienced in the process, particularly during sort of the current circumstances. Looking at the many facets of this collaboration, really from the curatorial to the educational and the engagement side of things, was really one of the priorities, one of the ideas that we had in mind as organizers of the symposiums, as these are aspects that are rarely addressed in a public forum in association to Islamic art, and yet of considerable importance, particularly for those of us who work in the heritage sector. The 5 speakers will follow each other, and I will eventually come back to moderate the final discussion and take more of the questions from the audience. The first speaker will be Amy Graves, who is the registrar for exhibitions and projects at the Courtauld Institute, and who will tell us more about the logistics and the organizational side of Precious and Rare. She will also touch briefly on the first venue of the show, Truro, before handing over to Sonia Kielty, who is the volunteer coordinator for the libraries, museums and galleries at Bradford. Following Sonia will be Federica Gigante, the curator of the collection for the Islamic world at the History of Science Museum at the University of Oxford, and the exhibition volunteer Jonathan Fruchter, who will tell us about what they have done in Oxford. And closing the panel will be Sylvie Brusin, assistant curator at the Holborn Museum in Bath, who will give us a taster instead of what's to come for the final venue of the exhibition. Therefore, without further ado, I will now hand over to Amy and the rest of the panelists.
So I'm Amy Graves, and I'm the Registrar for Exhibitions and Projects at the Courtauld, and I've had the absolute pleasure of working on this touring exhibition, and kind of just reiterating what Professor Allan mentioned, that the objects themselves are absolutely incredible. So it's been a real eye-opener for me, and I've really enjoyed the experience. I just wanted to briefly recap kind of what the Courtauld offer was in conjunction with the Art Fund and the SSN. We at the Courtauld have been responsible for all the packing and transportation of the artworks, the object mounts and the plinths. We've been able to offer to all the venues registrarial help, help from our curator, and also from the SSN for Islamic art and material culture. We were able to give a research package to help all the venues with their interpretation. We've offered a public lecture delivered by Professor Suzanne Babai, who you'll hear from later. And we also made a short film on the conservation of the metalwork itself. Just to recap, these are the 10 beautiful objects. I mean, James touched on all of them, but I thought I would just show you again the 10 that we've been able to lend to the 4 venues. Just very briefly on pre-tour logistics. We had a partner meeting back in March 2019 at the Courtauld in London, where all of the partner venues could come. They were able to see the objects in person, get some object handling in, but also meet the specialist metal conservator, Diana Heath, who you can see at the bottom of this slide. She was able to clean and re-lacquer all of the objects, which actually hadn't really been done since 1965. So a real plus for us, really. And the objects look stunning after that. Once Diana had conserved all the objects, we had a professional photographer come and take some beautiful photos post-conservation. We had Christie's come to our offsite store to value all of the objects for all the government indemnity applications. We commissioned a bespoke travelling crate, and you can just see here a picture of of a layer from inside the crate, just to see how neat and well packed all the objects have been. And we also were able to visit all of the partners pre the pandemic, which was actually amazing. So that was myself, Alexandra Gerstein, the curator, and our museum technician, Matthew Thompson. As been mentioned, the first leg of the tour was at the Royal Cornwall Museum in Truro, and that was back in September last year. The Royal Cornwall Museum was founded by the Royal Institute of Cornwall in 1818 to promote the excellence in science and art. They have a really varied collection base, and they have also a very small collection of Islamic metalwork. And when in the application, their collections and exhibitions manager, Michael Harris, said that collections of this quality at the Courtauld have rarely been seen in Cornwall. And it was really a great opportunity for them to also shout about their own Islamic collection. So it was a really great starting point for the tour. And as mentioned, all 4 venues have been able to interpret and display these 10 objects in any way that they like, which has actually been a really interesting aspect of the tour, and kind of reiterates what James was saying as well about all the different narratives for the objects. So in Cornwall, they were able to display the objects in their spotlight gallery, which is quite a small room, but enables them to highlight a single theme. They worked quite closely with the SSN for Islamic Metalwork, and the SSN were able to identify some of their own collections, which was really great because those items were then included within their exhibition, which was really exciting for them and a great kind of addition to the story. We had a few logistical challenges there, one being exhibition design, and I'm just showing you here on the slide are Matthew, one of his wonderful design drawings that he helped with kind of the layout and mock-ups, and he also was able to build some bespoke wooden shelving, which you can see at the bottom of the slide, and painstakingly colour matched to the Royal Cornwall Museum's bases of their cases. And this is just a selection of images of the display itself. I mean, the images don't really do it justice because it was a really beautiful display. And you can see how well Matthew's shelves matched the base of the case, and the blue actually looked really beautiful with the objects. And you can see that they had this beaker here. I don't know if you can see that, but this is a Cornwall object, and they had 3 Persian tiles as well in the coffee table case. So the next venue was Cartwright Hall Art Gallery in Bradford, and the exhibition moves there in January of this year. The objects were displayed in their place gallery alongside works from their permanent collection. We had different logistical challenges in Bradford. They were not able to do their own interpretation, so we were really lucky and we were able to reuse all of the labels and panels from the Cornwall display. They have beautiful wooden panelled walls in their gallery, but because of that, you're not allowed to put any panels or labels on the wall. So again, Matthew Thompson made some bespoke wooden hanging panels and a selection of beautiful plinths, which you can see here, that he covered in the Bradford purple, and also helped with life-size mock-ups, as you can see down there. We shared the installation between myself, the curator, Sasha, and the Bradford team, and this is just an image of me cleaning one of the cases. We had a lot of press coverage during the installation, which was really, really excellent. And this is just an image here showing how we were able to cut up all of the Royal Cornwall Museum label text just to ensure the best kind of visitor experience in Bradford. And that also involved a lot of moving around with the objects and kind of playing around with the plinths to get the best looking display. And here's some pictures of the finished display. I mean, you can see how beautiful the place gallery is with the wooden panelling, and you can see here Matthew's wonderful wooden hanging panels for our panels to go on top. So the coronavirus pandemic and lockdown 1 hit whilst the objects were in Cartwright Hall Art Gallery, which meant they had to close on the 22nd of March. And of course, at that point, none of us knew the full impact of the pandemic or the length of the lockdown. Because of that, the team there had to apply for 2 extensions to their government indemnity, which is the insurance. And because of that, we also had to completely change the rest of the tour dates and the tour order. So I was working very closely with the History of Science Museum and the Holborn during lockdown. And I want to thank everyone for their flexibility in the schedule, because, you know, everyone's programming was very fluid at this point and no one knew what was going on. In Bradford themselves, we had to decide what we were going to do with the objects. Do we leave them in their gallery or do we decant to the main store? We decided to leave them in their gallery. I had many emails from their conservator and their registrar about their security lockdown procedures. They were able to send me environmental data every single week with the relative humidity and the temperature levels. We were able to host the online webinar with Professor Suzanne Barbailly, and they had a really good turnout. In fact, more people than they would have got physically in the building. And of course, they were able to reopen when restrictions were eased, and then they had to deal with things like one-way flows. And I want to thank Cartwright Hall for being such amazing custodians of the objects during the lockdown period. I just wanted to kind of highlight the changes in dates. So as I said, the objects started in Bradford in January. They were meant to stay until May, but clearly we were deep in lockdown at that point. So they actually did close on the 22nd of March, reopened on the 24th of August, and then finally closed on the 20th of September. The third venue was meant to be the Holborn, but that is now the History of Science Museum in Oxford, and the objects are sadly in lockdown there now, but will be there until January. And then they will move on to the Holborn Museum in Bath from late January until May next year, and that will open in conjunction with a Canaletto exhibition there. Because of the lockdown and the pandemic, we had to do a virtual deinstallation in Bradford. So I wasn't able to go as a physical courier. So we did everything online. We did lots of Wi-Fi tests in advance, but basically we did all the condition checking and the deinstallation on Zoom. It went really well. I'd worked well anyway with the Bradford team. We knew the conservator really well. He had a great knowledge of the objects anyway. But as you can see, I was able to watch on the screen all of the condition checking, signing of condition reports. I'd sent them packing notes, so they were able to pack in front of me. And then I was also able to see the crate being moved from the gallery down into their store, where it had to isolate for 3 days before it was collected to be taken without a courier to Oxford, where it also had to then isolate for another 3 days. So from a scheduling point of view, you know, the pandemic added a lot of time because I was having to deal with 6 days of isolation per changeover. So the exhibition then opened in Oxford on the 10th of September. It's displayed there with collections of their astronomical items. We had the similar logistical challenges to Bradford in that we had to do a virtual installation. A virtual installation is slightly more difficult than a de-installation because obviously you are kind of designing the exhibition on a screen, which is quite hard to see detail. It's hard to see nuances like light. But the team in Oxford were really, really great, and they were able to send me photographs on WhatsApp during the installation, so I could actually see detail. And this is just an example of them sending me a photo of the bag on its mount, so I could check, you know, the angle and how things were being placed. And these are some images of the items in Oxford on display, which is very beautiful. And I just want to end by saying that although the lockdown and the pandemic did cause some anxiety and, you know, it was a very uncertain period and we had to do things differently, the pandemic really kind of highlighted a few important things, mainly that, you know, we had complete trust with all of our partners. And, you know, having such strong relationships really, really helped me to organise things during the pandemic. And I want to thank particularly Cartwright Hall and Art Gallery for that, and as well as the History of Science Museum. The fact that we visited all the venues pre-pandemic really paid off, because it meant that, you know, I understood exactly what each venue was going through. I knew the layout of the building. I had a really clear understanding. Virtual installations and de-installations are possible. You know, it's obviously not the same as being there in person, but as long as you're prepared, you've done Wi-Fi tests, you have everything kind of in advance, like condition reports, packing notes, then it is fine. And, you know, using a phone to film worked really well because you could see detail as much as, you know, as possible on a screen. But finally, I just want to say that the pandemic has actually allowed for a lot of virtual opportunity. The History of Science Museum website is a real kind of example of that. The online exhibition is a really great addition to this whole project. They also did an online private view, which worked really, really well. So just to say that maybe the pandemic, you know, it did cause problems, but it's also caused some really exciting things. And that's it. So just thank you to everyone. And I hope that you get a chance to see the exhibition either in Oxford or in Bath. Sorry, I should have said I'm now going to hand on to Sonia.
Good evening. Can everybody hear me? Yeah, I think you can. I'm going to share my screen as well. So I'm Sonia Courtauld, curator of exhibitions at the time last year when we had this exhibition at Bradford. And we'd been working on it all year, at least. And it was gorgeous. I think following on from what Amy just said, definitely first and foremost want to thank the team at the Courtauld, because they came to visit, worked with our collections, worked with our team, and yeah, pandemic. We also had gale force storm floods before the pandemic, so that delayed a Susan Babai talk as well. So you never know what's going to be thrown at you. So I totally thank Amy and team for all the hard work that they did. But I'm glad it's worked out, and good luck to Oxford, and hopefully this strange time will end soon. I am now devising a volunteer programme and an engagement programme for volunteers and local communities for Bradford. And actually this exhibition worked well because at the same time we did have an exhibition that I was curating called Kahila, which was based on the Bradford Jewish synagogue, which is little is very known about. It's only tiny. It was built in the 1880s, and it was literally 5 minutes walk down the road from Cartwright Hall. So those of you who do know Cartwright Hall Art Gallery, there's a picture of it on the left. And it's set in Lister Park. Those are the gorgeous Mughal gardens that you can see to the right. It's 1904 Edwardian building. And it's set in the town, well, the village really of Manningham, which is in Bradford. And it's always been a very migrant area. So early on in the 1800s, it was very much a German Jewish quarter setting up the textiles mills. And we've got tiny towns there called Little Germany, and it's all based on the history of the textile trade. In the 1940s, we had a new gang of immigrants from Pakistan in the Manipur region, and they are now living in the Manningham area, roughly around sort of a mile round radius, I'd say. So we have a good demographic mix. Obviously, like most towns, we've had the Irish, we've got lots of Polish, Latvian, it's hugely diverse, set in West Yorkshire. So in our collections, we've got a good South Asian collection, which we started primarily in the 80s and early 90s. And this exhibition is one of the exhibitions that complement those collections, as we've heard other people speak about. So we particularly haven't got a large Islamic collection. We've got lots of South Asian and Indian. But the Islamic collection is mainly calligraphy, which we showed alongside. And that is a good contemporary artist we did show as a key feature. This was Syed, who I'll show you in a minute. She's got the holograph piece of artwork that was showed, which is the pen and the sword. If anyone knows Soraya Syed, she's based in Birmingham. Absolutely studious calligraphy work, but on a contemporary level. And we've also got paintings by Apna Kaur from India. So they set off the background to the way when Sasha and Amy came, we really laid out the show. On the right here, we had over 700 people, I think, to the opening, the launch, which was fantastic. So it was a real link to the Kahila show and the Precious and Rare exhibition, because we had a mix of faith leaders, different communities from both the Jewish and the local Islamic communities. That lady with the flowers there is Nudrat Afza. So she's the photographer whose show is Kahila, and she's a local lady from Manningham, top-notch self-taught photographer. And she, over a year, really got friendly with the Kahila, very small community now, only about 25 people attend sessions there. Most of the Jewish communities have left to go elsewhere. So she made friends and really got into the community there and was allowed to take these gorgeous photos that she takes in a black and white format. And the exhibition was Arts Council funded, and it just set off a beautiful backdrop to two different communities for us. At the bottom there, you can see Rudy Lever, who is the gorgeous chair of the synagogue. He's 93. He worked very closely with us and was one of our VIP guests with the Courtauld as well. And if anyone does know Cartwright Hall, you'll know that we're also the hometown of David Hockney, which also gives a bit of a backdrop. So we are used a lot by schools, internationally and locally and regionally and nationally. But again, it's this link of communities that for the present and for the future, for the next few years at least, we're very keen to link up with. This, just a bit like Amy said, you can see different variations of how the show looked in what is one of our most beautiful galleries. It's where we've held weddings, conferences, beautiful panelled walls. In the background, you can see various parts of our collection. So the lovely, if you look at the bottom left, the lovely plate, which was one of the 10 gorgeous objects from the Courtauld, was set just in front of the Apna Kaur painting, which again is quite circular and gold. And it was just a lovely backdrop. Lots of engagements, events. The two biggest bar the launch we had was for International Women's Day. We gave a talk in the town hall in Bradford, and I used the idea of two brilliant women that were showing at the time at Cartwright Hall, and that was our lovely noble lady and her bag, and the gorgeous contemporary photographer from Manningham, Nudrat. And it was just, it's the idea that you've got human stories that link from 13th century Mosul with a lady and her bag to a contemporary photographer now today in Bradford in Yorkshire. And who knew that one day these gorgeous classical antiquities would be the source of a lot of communal meetings and projects. We also had an evening where Muslim volunteers were celebrated and over 200 people attended. So we had West Yorkshire Fire Service, West Yorkshire Police, all giving awards to our local, especially young Muslim guys and girls. So that was just a really gorgeous backdrop. And I gave a talk on the show. And it was just 10 objects that could create such community and cohesion from all faiths, and how everything, even with the Warhol in the background there, everything just creates a good neutral space for debate. And you can see our Courtauld girls there celebrating with a glass of wine. So if that's really it, I just want to sort of emphasize that touring partnerships just produce these amazing possibilities, and to have the nationals around the regions is a must. Although we have our collections, you can't beat getting a team of different conservators, designers. Matthew was fantastic working with Dale, our conservator, and everyone skill shares. And I think it's that kind of partnership that just is a morale boost for cities. And in a time when there was a pandemic, it was great to extend the deadline and people could come and see it if they haven't seen it yet. So keep an eye out for the Bradford Synagogue, keep an eye out for more antiquities from the Courtauld, and keep telling your people's stories and your human stories. And do ask me if there's any questions or any contacts that you need, do let me know. And I will stop sharing and hand over to the next speaker. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Sonia, for your talk. I'm Federica Gigante, and I'm the curator of the collection from the Islamic world at the History of Science Museum in Oxford. And I am the only privileged person here today to actually be with the objects. So I am presenting directly from our galleries, and you can see the exhibition behind me. You will now be quite familiar with this handbag, about which Professor James Allan has already explained quite a few details. What I am going to talk to you today, however, is not about the objects themselves, as you will have heard already enough about them. Amy has already showed some examples of how the objects have been exhibited. So what I want to focus here today is really about how we brought this exhibition together and how we came up with the interpretation that we gave to the objects. Unfortunately, as many of you will understand, and many of the other speakers will already have pointed out, we were not able to do what we had envisaged to with these objects because of the pandemic. So this is not the result of our plan A, nor of our plan B, but probably we're around plan D. In any event, the show is here, and for the time being has had a wonderful success, and is accompanied by our online exhibition that you will be able to access through the link that has just been put in the chat. For me as a curator, this has been an exhibition done upside down, if you allow me the term. Normally, a curator comes up with an idea, a theme, a concept that he would like to illustrate, and so starts compiling a list of objects to illustrate these points. Well, in this case, we had this marvelous collection of metalwork that was coming our way, and we had to think about a way to present it, to extract themes and ideas from the objects, rather than the other way around. It is in this context that we have brought in our team of volunteers from the Multaqa team. Now, let me briefly explain what Multaqa is for those of you who have never heard of it. Multaqa in Arabic means meeting point. And it is a project that originally started in Berlin and then was brought here in Oxford, and is based at the History of Science Museum and the Pitt Rivers Museum, that brings in volunteers from refugee communities or people with a background and a general interest or connection with the Islamic world, to volunteer in our museum. The result is that people who might come from source communities are able to contribute to our museum and our interpretation. And at the same time, they get integrated into our own culture and our country, this country, through their own material culture. The opportunities this creates for them are vast. It allows them to build confidence, practice their English. They give tours in English, for example, but it also allows them to get work experience. And you're all very well aware of how hard it is to get work experience when you don't have any work experience to start with. It also allows them to have referees for any future possibility of working in this country. These volunteers have normally been involved with tours and talks or organizing events for the museum. However, this was the first full exhibition in which they were meant to be involved from the outset and in a way co-produce the exhibition and the interpretation. And it's this particular case that I want to talk to you about today. I should also point out that my position here within the museum, which is generously funded by the John Ellerman Foundation, was created in particular, and here I'm actually quoting, to integrate the curatorial role with community engagement, supporting volunteers from diverse backgrounds and source communities. This, of course, is what I'm hoping to achieve by working with the Multaqa team and the volunteers so far. This, of course, was the plan before COVID came in. But let's wait a moment for that and go a bit more into the details of the initial stages of the exhibition preparation. There was an initial meeting with many of the volunteers present, in which the Courtauld objects were shown. And first feedback and information started to come in. Unfortunately, was not present to that meeting as I hadn't joined the museum yet, but I heard so much about it. Some people, some of our volunteers, for example, pointed out how a metal handbag, probably bigger and less lavishly decorated than our bag here in the show, was used by her grandmother to put linen in. That's because metal is the best to keep insects at bay, which was a detail that none of us had thought about, for example. Or for the shape of the bowls that you have seen already and some of which are behind me. Some of the volunteers have pointed out they have the shape of the bowls that were used to put sweets for the end of Ramadan. And that was a really interesting experience because it brought these objects very much to our own day and showed how this tradition continued to the present day. At a second meeting with a smaller group of volunteers, the selected ones to help us with the exhibition, there was 4 of them, a more interesting level of details from the objects started to emerge. We took each and single object, photographs of them, and started to think about one detail that was relevant. I contributed my experience in Islamic art, and they contributed their own experience of these objects that was very much firsthand. There was one theme that emerged throughout these objects, and that was that these objects were themselves multaqa. They were meeting points, because each and every one of them showed that they were the combination of different cultures and different peoples coming together, exactly like the volunteers were coming together in our museum. So we started to think about uniting this group of objects under this theme. Therefore, the subtitle or subtitle of the exhibition here in Oxford is Cultures in Conversation. We decided to show how these cultures were in conversations within the objects themselves. And now I'm going to share a presentation just to show you a few of these objects and how we have gone about the interpretation. So what you can see here is the first of our cases that is behind me. And you can see this delightful bowl that shows a lotus flower. And it is most interesting because lotus flowers originally come from East and Southeast Asia. They're typical of Chinese and Indian art, but we see it here in a bowl that was made in Egypt. And that is because these decorative motifs were brought across Central Asia by the Mongol nomadic tribes that moved around from the borders with China all the way to the Eastern Mediterranean. Hence, this bowl itself, though probably the most humble of all our objects, represent this fusion of cultures. As you will have seen, even the famous handbag shows a very mixture of cultures. Made in Mosul, an Arabic metalwork in center for a Mongol lady that was sitting here, as you can see in the representation of the lid, in a Persian court. We have seen these bowls that show a shield the European way, made for jousting with a little indentation on one side, as you will be able to see in this illustration from a French manuscript, and made for export to Europe. So again, a fusion of different cultures coming together. Or for example, the other way around, this medallion made in the fashion of the Islamic world, featuring on a plate that was made in Italy in the 1500s, made with the Islamic inlaid techniques, as well as with decorative motifs that come from the Islamic world. So, in a way, the exhibition encapsulates this mixture of cultures and people in a very similar way to what we'd like to do with the volunteers within the museum. I'll now stop sharing. As I said, COVID came in, and unfortunately we were not able to fully involve the volunteers as we wished we could have. So apart from these initial meetings, then the interpretation had to be written by museum curators without them being involved, and that was because we were locked down due to the pandemic. However, my colleague Rana Ibrahim, who works for the Multaqa team, had started to work with the volunteers on some of their own objects. Basically writing labels as if these were museum objects. The idea was that they would be included in the show. However, due to the pandemic, we were not able to use the same space that we had planned to. So we had to reduce the number of cases, which also meant we couldn't display these objects. However, the texts were written. They're available online. You can see them through our online exhibition. And it was a very interesting exercise of writing about objects that belong to our modern culture, but date back to these metalwork pieces that you see behind me. And we did that together, bit by bit, editing it. And I hope that was a very well thought through and also learning opportunity. Certainly was for me, and hopefully was for the volunteers. However, that was not only the type of contribution we got from our volunteers. Something quite extraordinary also happened, because one of our Multaqa volunteers, who has a background in math, produced something quite remarkable for our show. And I would like now to hand over to Jonathan to explain directly what he has done for us as one of our volunteers. So Jonathan, now the word is to you.
Thank you, Federica. So as Federica said, I'm Jonathan, and I'm a math PhD student at the University of Oxford. And over the past few months, I was a part of the Multaqa team. And I have to say it was a great experience. I was really happy to meet the other volunteers and meet everyone involved in the exhibition. So before I show you my contribution to the exhibition, I would like to say a few words. So in the meanwhile, please enjoy the objects of the exhibition in the form of hyperbolic patterns. When I first heard about the opportunity to volunteer with the exhibition, I was really excited. having grown up in Jerusalem, I was always interested in Islamic art, and I also really like working with my hands, so the topic of metalwork seemed really appropriate. However, when I saw the objects of the exhibition, it was the beautiful patterns and the rich symmetries that really stood out to me. And perhaps this is not surprising because the topic of my PhD thesis is basically groups of symmetries of weird geometric objects. I would also like to say that generally I'm really eager to show people how fun and beautiful math can be, and I thought that this would be a great opportunity to do so, and especially in an impressive venue like the History of Science Museum in Oxford. And so trying to get everyone involved in the exhibition hooked on the idea of symmetry, I decided to create a digital version of the pattern on the metal handbag, which you've probably seen already. And so, as I said, I decided to create a digital version of the pattern on the metal handbag. And I realized that it was really a simple task. It wasn't something hard to do because the pattern on the handbag is so repetitive. It was enough for me to make really a small fragment of the pattern and then just let the computer copy this fragment around to create the entire pattern. And more generally, this led me to think about the possibilities of using computers to generate Islamic-inspired patterns in the digital era. So thinking about that, I decided to make a computer program that does exactly this. It basically lets people create their own Islamic-inspired patterns using a computer. So I will now show you the computer program. And I will start by saying that this computer program is based on a type of symmetry called P6M in the mathematical jargon. And simply speaking, this type of symmetry is characterized by these 6 pointed stars, which you should be able to see on the screen now. And out of the 17 types of symmetries of the plane, that's the one most common in Islamic art. So that's why I went with this one. And the interface of the program is really simple and it resembles a paint program. And the idea is that the users create their design in the big triangle at the bottom. And then the program copies this design into each of these small triangles, which you can see on top. What I find really fascinating about this program is how something like the doodle I'm just making at the bottom, which seems to be really chaotic and unstructured, becomes something beautiful when put in the context of a symmetrical structure. And so I would also like to invite everyone listening to play around with the program, which I find really fun. Like, I hope it will also be fun for you. And just so you know, the program works virtually on any platform. So you can also try it out with a touch screen, which perhaps is a better experience on your mobile phone or tablet. And yeah, so the program is available on the History of Science Museum's website, and I will also post a link in the chat in a couple of minutes. And the last thing I want to say is that I know I use the word symmetry a lot, and perhaps it's not clear what I mean when I say symmetry. So I would also like to invite you to watch a short animation I made for this exhibition, which explains the basic concepts of symmetry and the relations between symmetry and the objects of the exhibition, and perhaps even Islamic art in general. And I know it might sound a bit heavy, but the animation is really fun, and everything comes from the mouth of ancient Persian mathematician Muhammad ibn Musa al-Khwarizmi. So I will also put a link for that in the chat. And thanks for listening, everyone. And I will now hand to the next speaker.
So my name is Sylvie Brucine. I'm the assistant curator at the Holborn Museum, where we'll be showing Precious and Rare. It will be opening on the 21st of January. So we will be the last venue to show the exhibition. I'm just going to share my screen with you now. As you already know from Amy's talk, this exhibition was originally scheduled to be held in Bath over this summer, and of course this had to change due to the impact of COVID-19. My talk is going to be a bit of a sneak preview of what we're going to be doing, what we have planned at the Holborn Museum. And also I'm going to focus on some of the changes we've had to make due to our changes in the exhibition programme, and some of the opportunities and challenges that have arisen from these changes. So Precious and Rare was scheduled, or is scheduled to open at the same time as 2 other exhibitions in January. One is another show that I'm working on the early years of the British artist Thomas Lawrence. And the other show is an exhibition of paintings of Venice by Canaletto that will be on loan to us from Woburn Abbey. In our original programme, we had always planned to show Canaletto and Precious and Rare alongside one another, knowing that the 2 exhibitions would complement one another well, particularly in regards to exploring the role of Venice as a historic trading route. The other show, Thomas Lawrence Coming of Age, is a reduced version of what would have been our major autumn show. And as it's a reduced version, it's now going into our smaller exhibition space, which we call the Worth Gallery. And I've got a couple of images of this here. And this was actually originally the space that we were planning on showing Precious and Rare. And I've got a couple of images from an exhibition that was held at the Holborn back in 2018. So this is a collection of Middle Eastern art that was bought by Miss Ellen Tanner, who travelled to the Middle East in the late 19th century and acquired a number of objects that she later gifted to the Holborn Museum. So as you can see from these images, that this space is it's quite a small, intimate space, really a spotlight gallery that focuses, that suits focused, quite small exhibitions. And this was the original concept for our display for the Courtauld Islamic Metalwork show. But as our programming changed, it was decided that Thomas Lawrence, which is mostly works on paper, was better suited to this exhibition space. And instead, Precious and Rare would move to a different space in the museum, our ballroom gallery, which, as you can see from this image, is a completely different type of space to the Worth Gallery. It's very big, it's very light, it's quite grand space with these sort of big windows and this sort of beautiful vista looking out to Great Pulteney Street and towards the centre of Bath. It's a space where we've regularly held exhibitions, and these have always been in this large table case that you see in the centre of the room here. This case, just in the past couple of weeks, has actually been dismantled and removed from the room, making it a much more open and flexible space. So Precious and Rare will actually be the first exhibition we hold in the ballroom that isn't on this large table case. Instead, we're splitting, this has enabled us to split the 10 highlight objects into 6 different cases that are going to be spread across the entire of the room. And we're going to have the metalwork bag right in the very centre of the room as the real highlight object, and the first thing that visitors see as they enter the room. One of the really positive changes that has been made as a result of us moving the exhibition to this space is that it enables us to be able to show each object in the exhibition all the way in the round, which I think is a really, really positive change and is something that I feel will really enhance the visitor experience. The other very positive thing about moving the exhibition to this space is that it enables a much better dialogue. Gallery where we'd originally intended to show the exhibition is a dedicated exhibition space that sits quite separately from our permanent collection. The ballroom, on the other hand, is a space where we show some of the real highlights from particularly William Holborn's collection, William Holborn being the 19th century collector whose objects form the core of the collection at the museum. William Holborn and Thomas Gambier Parry were collecting around the same time, and they shared some similar tastes, particularly for metalwork and also Italian Renaissance maiolica, examples of which we have on display in our ballroom. So this dish, for example, which is dated to 1526, and this sits in the sort of one of the centerpieces of one of our maiolica displays. This was possibly made in Venice, and so may have been made sort of around the same time and in the same city as the pair of candlesticks and the large dish that we are getting on loan as part of Precious and Rare. The presence of maiolica in the ballroom also speaks to the links between East and West and the vast trade networks that exist between the Islamic world and Europe. Italian maiolica, owing to the invention of lusterware in the 9th and 10th centuries in Iran and Egypt, a technique that was spread across the Muslim world and came to Spain in the 13th century, from where it was exported across Europe from Valencia and Mallorca. We also have on permanent display a case dedicated to 17th century silverware from across Europe, including sort of Germany, France, Britain, and Italy, and Venice in particular. And included in this is a rosewater basin, which was made in early 17th century London, and its original function would have been it would have held scented water that would have been handed between guests during dinner, so they could wash their hands between courses. And it's a similar function to not only the Italian Renaissance maiolica, but also the possible function of some of the objects that are on display as part of Precious and Rare. So, for example, the large 14th century Mamluk bowl. So we're hoping this display will really reflect a commonality in dining rituals across various different time periods and cultures. So by showing Precious and Rare in our ballroom, we hope to draw connections between our collection and the Courtaulds, particularly around themes of function, trade, collecting, and the luxury goods market and material culture of Renaissance Europe and the Islamic world. So those are some of the really positive changes that have come out of our flexibility and our changes to the exhibition programme. There have also been some challenges. So one example of this is we've been having to think much, it's been much trickier to work out how to deal with graphics, for example, in this space. So though it's a much larger space than our smaller Worth gallery, there's actually far less free wall space due to the fact that we show our permanent collection here. And so we've had to really think about placement and format of graphics, particularly at this time during COVID, where we are going to be implementing a one-way system. We're also discussing how we manage things like our large print labels, which are a really significant, a really important resource for our visitors, but in its original printed format isn't appropriate during these times. So instead, we're thinking much more about digital resources and how we might use things like QR codes and PDFs that people can download from our website. I just wanted to end by very briefly mentioning our learning and engagement program, which is sort of under development at the moment. And although it's under development, there is already work being done around Precious and Rare. And I wanted to end by sharing these images that were made as part of a virtual art group that was called Creativity for Wellbeing, which is part of our Pathways to Wellbeing program that supports people with lived experience of mental health issues, social isolation and homelessness to engage with creative art activities in order to help improve mental health and well-being. So this virtual art group involves online workshops and downloadable activities that you can access from our website that encourages participants to create a piece of work inspired by our collection or a piece on loan to us from an exhibition. And a couple of weeks ago, the group focused on the 13th century incense burner. And these are some of the images, some of the artworks that were made that were inspired by this object. So I just wanted to end by sharing those images and to say thank you again for inviting me to be part of this symposium.
Thank you, Sylvie, and thank you to all the panelists for generously sharing really your experiences. I was particularly struck by the resilience and the inventiveness of all of you involved, particularly during the current challenges. I hope that the public and the people who are following us are following also the messages in the chat, where links to Sonia's hologram, Jonathan's program, as well as the explanation and the History of Science Online Museum website are posted. Please do take a look, because you'll find there also the contribution of the Multica volunteers. We really don't have a lot of time for questions, I'm afraid, because I need to leave a little bit of time for Suzanne Babai for her final remarks. There was one question in particular about the program that Jonathan used. And a user in particular asked whether you utilized open source tools or closed source tools. And I wonder whether you could address this before I hand over to Suzanne.
Yeah, so the program was made entirely using open source tools, and particularly GeoGebra, which I have to say it's another really fun program to use, which is also great to use, not just in the context of Symmetry. And anyone interested, the source code itself is available for download through the GeoGebra website. So if you have any idea of something you can do with this program, feel free to download it and modify it as you wish.
All right, thank you. Thank you for that. I'm happy to sort of leave the floor to any questions that people may have before our closing remarks. I don't see any specifically for the panel at the moment in the feed. I myself am very curious about some of the logistical challenges that Amy in particular sort of highlighted. The virtual installation and day installation, the virtual condition checking was particularly interesting. And I wanted to ask, what are these Wi-Fi tests?
The Wi-Fi tests were really simply to just check that the Wi-Fi would work. So about a week before the installation in Bradford, the registrar was in the gallery and we were doing test Zoom calls and test Teams calls to just check whether the Wi-Fi would hold up, because obviously without good Wi-Fi, a virtual installation or deinstallation is kind of impossible. And I suppose the only thing we could have done in that situation would have been through photographs and chat on WhatsApp. But thankfully, in both Bradford and Oxford, the Wi-Fi held and we were able to proceed without any problems.
That's very interesting. I wonder if anybody in the panel has questions for the panelists or for aspects of the experiences of the venues involved.
Thank you. I found that all really interesting, and despite knowing well the program, obviously, I just wondered if this sort of engagement with a collection, and this is kind of for all of the partners, this engagement with a collection, or even for you, Francesca, would change the way, you might conceive of an exhibition. If the built-in sort of flexibility of dealing with material from another collection, inserting it into one's collection, how much more challenging that is than having a standalone exhibition. The sort of challenges of integrating a collection into one's own collection, because it always sounds, in theory, an interesting idea, but in fact, we have realized logistically, but intellectually as well, and kind of culturally, that it's aesthetically, in every level, it's a challenge, because things are designed for a specific reason or purpose. And yes, I wonder if that's kind of a stimulating challenge. Or
is it a question for me, or
you could answer the question, because you're not one of the only 3 of the 4 partners are here, and you, why not?
No, I think it's always an opportunity, you see. It creates a problem, and therefore, the way you react to the problem. I mean, I think what's come clearly from the conversation is that even with the physical challenges, even with the delays, each one of the venues has reacted and adjusted and kind of calibrated, if you wish, their expectations. I mean, it was interesting to hear about Federica's experience as being the plan D, and not even the plan A or B or C, which, teaches us a lot in the sense that, it lends us or teaches us how to be, again, more inventive, more resilient, and particularly facing the challenges of moving forward. Let's face it, loans are expensive, difficult, threatening for the objects for the most part, because it's not ideal sending objects too much around, and so and they leave a big carbon footprint. So in the new world, in the post-COVID world, how do we think about engaging our audiences in ways that may not be the conventional ones, and how that transforms also the experience of the object, when you don't have an original object, when you have a virtual object. What new problem does this create? And I think, in a way that the COVID pandemic, from a certain point of view, if you want to see it from another side, has created interesting problems for us as heritage people to think about new opportunities and new ways of undertaking our job as the landscape changes and shifts. And I don't know if anybody has any additional comment about your question.
No, but thank you. That, if no one else has that is the point, isn't it? That the object in relation to something unexpected, or it changes the nature of the inquiry and what one wants to perhaps promote, or how I'm just very interested how open-ended these projects can be. And the truth is, when we had the handling session and meeting at the Courtauld, we also asked the partners, what would you like? And it seemed to come back that actually some help with the interpretation was really helpful, was actually, so we did provide that. But at the same time, if it hadn't been needed, and it's certainly at the History of Science Museum, it's another approach. In fact, our interpretation hasn't figured. So yeah,
it's more to you as well, as the objects come back to your institutions. It's an extra set of windows through which you can look at them.
Oh, that's certain. So
either for the reinstallation or for things to come, they are ever giving. There's no single narrative, no closed story, and I think that's the fun of dealing with objects in a way. That it's an open-ended experience, and as our need or preoccupation or interest shift, those objects tell different stories. James spoke about, the link with empire. We never really thought about Gambier Perry's collection through that lens. And there's here a whole set of other conversations that one could have. I can see that there are sort of some messages streaming in, but we are really running out of time. I can only say that, yes, the recording will be available for this talk, I believe, on the research forum or on the Courtauld website, where all the other wonderful initiative and talks are kept. So keep an eye for that. And I now, I have only 5 minutes to hand over to my dear esteemed colleague Professor Suzanne Babai, who joined the Courtauld Institute in 2013 to take up a newly established post, teaching the arts of Iran and Islam, after teaching in the US for many years. And she has published also on a wide range of topics with a wide range of interests, really. It is incredible, actually, that we had her to properly close this conversation that started at the Courtauld and will eventually come back to the Courtauld. So I will say goodbye from me to our panelists and to the public. Thank you, everyone, for joining us tonight, and handing over to Suzanne for the final remarks.
Thank you very much. Good evening, everyone. Thank you, Francesca. Thank you, all the panelists. I have had the privilege of making it to Truro, but not to Bradford, except for online, and not to Oxford yet. and hoped to get to Bath in the end. This was fantastic. And I wanted to say, following what Francesca said, I arrived at the Courtauld when that wonderful exhibition on the bag, the Courtauld bag, was organized and researched by Dr. Rachel Ward, already mentioned by Professor Allan, and that I became the beneficiary of this, and indeed started teaching with the objects, and particularly the bag, as it was being cleaned and prepared for the exhibition in ways that I could not have imagined as I arrived at the Courtauld, actually from Germany immediately, but nevertheless. So I wanted to just close up by pointing to one, the celebration of this traveling exhibition, which has assumed a new identity each time it has landed. I can't wait to see also what is at Oxford's venue. The significance of this collection, though only a handful of objects have been chosen for this exhibition, nonetheless, this really enhances the Courtauld Gallery, where Islamic arts, which is a designation now very much under stress and anxiety-ridden somewhat, as we always ask what's Islamic in Islamic designation of the arts. But that what I wanted to point to was the fact that these objects were on display in a gallery whereby Gambier Parry's whole collection was on display, which includes Italian Renaissance, medieval material, French ivory, and so forth. And therefore, it had a home that is not separated from other works of art or isolated in any way, but actually embedded in what is an art historical home, if you will. This is what I wanted to underscore. Islamic arts, however we define it, belong to art history in general, or the histories of the arts across the globe as we look at them in terms that are crisscrossing traditions, cultures, preferences, styles, technologies, and so forth. I wanted to, these all go back also to many points that Professor Allan made about the collection, and through which he alerted us to some of those issues that make these objects with a provenance from the Islamic world, if you will, so significant for us. In the context of nation-based art histories, this is an anomaly. We talk about Chinese art, we talk about Irish art, French art, and so forth, but we talk about Islamic art in a way that flattens the distinctions amongst these different traditions, their linguistic distinctions, their cultural and visual distinctions, and so forth. On the other hand, they are united on many different levels in terms of the some preferences, some postures, artistic postures. I also wanted to point out how important it has been to think about these objects in juxtaposition with other objects, which function differently, say scientific objects, for instance. And from there to go to the point of objects of utility, which tend to be the descriptions of them. What was their function, essentially? And bring up the famous example of a Kashmiri-born Pakistani artist, Anwar Shemza, who famously attended, when he moved to London in 1956, he has attended a lecture given by the great art historian Ernst Gombrich, during which Gombrich dismissed Islamic arts as purely functional. This actually had a consequence. Shemza destroyed all his works, in fact, and started looking at Klee, Mondrian, and Kandinsky for new inspiration before he went back to looking at Islamic arts or works of art that would represent the traditions of Islam. This, in fact, is the point that I wanted to underscore, that whilst we look at these objects, like the bag, for instance, and many other ones that have been highlighted in terms of the various aspects of the flow of information, of motifs, of ideas, of technologies, ultimately, we are talking about the specificities of those who make them, those who choose what to pick from another cultural scene through objects that are in mobility, that travel around, be it by way of the Mongols or by way of the Alexandrian interventions even further before Islam, and European interventions. But ultimately, every one of these objects are products of cultural choices that are produced within these transcultural networks, that the artists, the craftsmen have made very conscious and extremely deliberate choices about whether or not they want to pick and then transform a pattern from some other resource or not, and how do they want to merge these into the specific distinctive identity of those objects and their cultural settings. That, to me, is one of the greatest lessons of looking at Islamic arts, learning about it, and in its totality from above, in a kind of a bird's eye view, but also specificities. The bag at the Courtauld is one of those great examples. It belongs to more than one place. It's made with more inspiration than we think is only ethnically Arab or Persian or Mongol or whatever other tag we might want to attach to them. And in that regard, these are distinctive kinds of objects and really belong to the larger family or families of art histories. And I am grateful for every opportunity we have had for these objects to speak to such a diverse communities across the UK, and we welcome you all back at the Courtauld when the objects come back. And thank you for inviting me.